It has been an interesting week for investors, starting with President Trump because he half jokingly and half seriously tossed around the idea of abolishing the income tax and replacing it with tariffs. Along with that, we have a new Chinese competitor in AI called DeepSeek, which is supposedly cheaper, smarter, and faster than ChatGPT. But I already made a video about that. You can watch that down in the description. And then, of course, Jerome Powell, who is the chairman at the Federal Reserve Bank, gave a speech where he said inflation is still a problem. He expects it to continue being a problem in 2025. He says tariffs could make inflation worse, and because of that, he's not cutting interest rates right now. So what I want to do in this video is talk about two things. Number one, I want to talk about what Jerome Powell said about inflation, where inflation is going, and interest rates. And then I want to talk about how that ties into Trump's idea of potentially abolishing the income tax and replacing it with tariffs, because they kind of layer on top of one another. So starting with what Jerome Powell, who was the chairman at the Federal Reserve Bank, said. What he said is that, quote, the committees, meaning the Federal Reserve Bank's 2% inflation goal, will be retained and will not be a focus for review. So the Federal Reserve Bank still wants to hit a 2% inflation target, but they're not at 2% inflation yet. What Jerome Powell said is that in 2024, regular inflation came in at 2.6%, and core inflation, which is when you strip out what he calls the volatile numbers, energy and food, then inflation came in at 2.8% in 2024. So we're off the highs, but we're not at 2% yet. So he says the inflation job is not done. But he says there's some good news. The good news is that our economy is growing. In 2024, our GDP in the United States grew by more than 2% because of, quote, resilient consumer spending. What does that mean? Let's explain that in plain English. Resilient consumer spending means that Americans are spending money that they don't got. Because here's the thing. The rate of inflation might be falling, but inflation hasn't gone away, because don't forget, all the years that we've been seeing inflation, and I'm going to ignore pre-COVID, but 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, all those years of inflation compound on top of one another. And what we also know is that for the majority of that time, the inflation rate outpaced the wage growth rate, which means the prices of things have gone up faster than people's incomes. Now, what a lot of people are pointing to is, hey, if you look at the data today, incomes are rising faster than inflation, which, sure, maybe the data says that, but that doesn't mean that the prices of incomes, the prices of people's wages, have risen fast enough to make up for all the higher price growth that we have seen in 2021 and 2022 and the first half of 2023. So take that for what it's worth. But Jerome Powell did say some good news, which is that the labor market is solid, meaning that the job market is good, and that the labor market is not a source of inflation, which means that if you get a raise, you're not making inflation worse. So some people were happy to hear that. But the question on everybody's mind is ultimately, what is the Federal Reserve Bank going to do with interest rates? Because if you want to get a mortgage rate, you want to get a car loan, it's expensive. And Trump has been demanding lower interest rates. He's been talking about this 3% mortgage rate. Is that going to happen? Well, Jerome Powell says that we have a long way to go before we can really start cutting interest rates aggressively. And when people ask Jerome Powell specifically, what are you going to do in regards to what Trump tells you? He says, I'm not going to change anything that I do, regardless of what Trump says. Here's what Jerome Powell said exactly. Quote, I'm not going to have any response or comment whatsoever on what the president says. It's not appropriate for me to do so because the Federal Reserve Bank, although they're called the Federal Reserve Bank, they're not a bank. You and I can't go there to deposit money. They're not a reserve. They're not sitting on any cash reserves, and they're not federal. They're not actually a part of the government, which is what makes it very unique. Now, that's what Jerome Powell said about inflation. Inflation is still a problem. We're not going to cut interest rates right now. We're going to ignore what Trump says. Now let's tie this into what's going on with this idea of tariffs and potentially getting rid of income taxes, because that all ties into this. Now, as a reminder, we cover this in Market Briefs. Market Briefs is my free financial newsletter where every day my team is breaking down what's happening in things like the economy, the housing market, the stock market, the crypto market, and the global economy into a fun and witty and easy to read newsletter. If you haven't joined Market Briefs yet, I highly recommend you do so, not just because, well, I created it, but because it's actually really useful. I read it every single morning, and we have hundreds of thousands of investors that are reading Market Briefs every day. And if you don't love it, you can unsubscribe at any time because it's free. So if you want to join Market Briefs, I got the link for you to join down in the description below. So, talking about tariffs, this is what Jerome Powell said when he was asked, are tariffs gonna make inflation worse? He said, quote, "The range of possibilities is very, very wide. We don't know for how long or how much or what countries. We don't know about retaliation. We don't know how it's going to transmit through the economy to consumers. That really does remain to be seen. And because of that, quote, the best thing we can do is what we've done, which is to study up on this, look at the historical experience, read the literature, and think about the factors that might matter, and then we'll just have to see how it goes." So what Jerome Powell said is, I don't know what's going to happen with tariffs, and so we can't predict, and because of that, well, they don't want to cut or raise interest rates in anticipation of it. Now, the reason why this is important is because earlier in 2024, a lot of people were talking about how the Federal Reserve Bank now is going to be scared to cut interest rates when you have tariffs on the horizon, because a lot of people are worried that tariffs could potentially make inflation worse. No, not everybody. Some people believe that tariffs are not going to touch inflation. Some people are scared that tariffs are going to make the inflation problem worse. But the whole idea behind tariffs, and you'll see how this ties into the income tax in just a second, but the whole idea behind tariffs is now, if you're buying something from China, or you're a business buying something from China, well, that business is going to have to pay a fine, a tax, a fee, a tariff, whatever you want to call it, in order to ship that product from China to here to incentivize you to make that same product in America. Now, we all know that labor in China and India and these other countries are lower, so it's cheaper to make those products in China. But if you slap on a tariff or a fine or a fee, well, then it makes them more expensive. In which case, maybe it is cheaper to make it in America. Maybe it is more efficient. Maybe it makes a little bit more sense to make that product in America. That's the whole idea behind tariffs. Now, the thing that Trump has been talking about is back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean back in the early 1900s, there was no income tax that was ratified into law. Taxes were through tariffs. And this is where Trump says that we can avoid the income tax by just using tariffs. Let me read you a quote from when Trump was passing around the idea of abolishing the income tax. This is what Trump said, quote, "We had no income tax. The income tax came in 1913. As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens." So that's what he's proposing. Let's shift where the taxes are coming from. Instead of taxing you for going to work, let's tax the product coming in from China. Now, if we look at the US Treasury, what we know is that a lot of money is coming in from income taxes. In 2023, there were $4.92 trillion collected by the IRS from the federal income taxes. So if you want to meet that, it means you got to collect trillions of dollars from foreign countries. Well, they're not actually coming from foreign countries directly. It's from the companies that are now buying the products from these foreign countries. And ultimately, all taxes are paid by consumers. It doesn't matter what type of tax you're talking about. It could be a corporate tax. It could be any tax you mean. Corporate taxes are not paid by corporations. They're paid by people. Because if a company has to pay a tax, well, the company makes money by selling things to people. When a corporation has to pay a tariff, well, the corporation is going to pay that tariff from the money that they make from people. So ultimately, when you think about taxes, all taxes ultimately come down to people, and it's just, where is that tax coming from? Is it from you when you make your money from your job, or is it from when you buy something at the store, or is it from you when you buy a property, or is it when a company buys something? So taxes are ultimately paid by people, and this is where Trump is saying, well, we can shift where the taxes are coming from. Instead of IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, we can use the ERS, the External Revenue Service, which is something that he's been talking about and that he proposed through his executive order as well. Now, of course, there's a lot of opinions here when it comes to the topic of tariffs as to, are they going to work? Are they going to make the prices of things worse? Because we know that inflation has been a problem. That is no news or concern. But the concern that some people have is that if you enact these tariffs on goods from China or other places, well, then the prices of things could go up by 10, 20, 30, 40%, depending on what the tariff is. And the argument against that is, well, no. Companies will move their products to America, they'll move their products to other countries, or they'll find a way to eat up the cost of the tariff. but we don't know. I mean, I did an analysis of tariffs and how they've happened in the past and how they've impacted the prices of things. Sometimes they can cause the prices of things to go up, sometimes they don't. And this is where Jerome Powell is actually right, because we don't know to what extent tariffs are going to be passed and onto what countries and to what retaliation we're going to see and what's going to happen in between. See, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and that's ultimately going to be the decision maker. Trump has talked about enacting tariffs in the next 100 days or something like that. And so once we get more clarity as to how much tariffs will be passed, if they'll be passed, and to what extent they'll be passed, then we'll have a little bit more clarity as to, well, what is actually going to happen? What are companies going to do in response? And so if the prices of things do go up, yes, that can make inflation worse, and that means that the Federal Reserve Bank might not be cutting interest rates aggressively. If the tariffs are not passed as aggressively, then maybe it could be a way that businesses could potentially eat up that cost. It could be a way for the government to generate some more revenue, and maybe they use that as a tool to potentially cut taxes. We don't know. There's a lot of speculation out there right now. There's a lot of guessing out there right now, and a lot of people are just spewing out a lot of emotional stuff, but we don't know. And that's why I always tell you, stay calm as an investor, because emotions are the enemy of profits, and find the opportunity. Now, I'll be keeping you posted here, and I'll also be keeping you posted on market briefs. If you haven't joined that, make sure you do so. But the whole idea here is understand what's happening. That way you can stay ahead of the curve instead of being one of the people that are staying behind the curve. And with that, I'll see you on YouTube tomorrow.